For nearly half a century, the world teetered on the brink of nuclear annihilation. Two superpowers, locked in an ideological struggle, transformed the globe into a chessboard where every move could trigger catastrophe. This is the story of the Cold War, a conflict fought not with direct warfare between giants, but through proxy wars, espionage, technological rivalry, and the constant shadow of mutual destruction. The Cold War emerged from the ashes of World War II. As Nazi Germany fell in 1945, the alliance between the United States and the Soviet Union crumbled almost immediately. Two incompatible visions collided: American capitalism and democracy versus Soviet communism and authoritarianism. By 1947, Europe lay divided. Winston Churchill declared that an Iron Curtain had descended across the continent. Eastern Europe fell under Soviet control. Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Romania, and Bulgaria became satellite states, their governments answerable to Moscow. President Truman responded with the Truman Doctrine, pledging American support to nations threatened by communism. The Marshall Plan pumped billions into rebuilding Western Europe, creating a buffer of prosperous, democratic allies. The battle lines were drawn. Then came the first major crisis. In June 1948, Stalin blockaded West Berlin, cutting off all land access to the isolated democratic enclave deep within Soviet-controlled East Germany. For 11 months, American and British planes flew around the clock, delivering food and supplies in the Berlin airlift. Stalin blinked first. The blockade ended, but Germany would remain split for decades. In August 1949, the Soviet Union detonated its first atomic bomb, shattering America's nuclear monopoly. The arms race exploded into terrifying life. Both nations developed hydrogen bombs 1,000 times more powerful than the weapons that destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki. By the 1960s, each side possessed enough nuclear weapons to destroy civilization several times over. The doctrine of mutually assured destruction, appropriately abbreviated as MAD, kept an uneasy peace. Neither side could launch a first strike without facing complete annihilation in return. The world learned to live under the mushroom cloud. Meanwhile, the conflict went global. In 1950, Communist North Korea invaded South Korea. The Korean War became the first major proxy conflict, with American forces supporting the South and Chinese troops backing the North. 3 years of brutal fighting ended in stalemate, cementing the 38th parallel as one of the world's most militarized borders. In 1949, Mao Zedong's communist forces won the Chinese Civil War, turning the world's most populous nation red. The communist bloc now stretched from Berlin to Beijing. The 1960s brought the Cold War to its most dangerous moment. In October 1962, American spy planes discovered Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba, just 90 miles from Florida. For 13 days, the world held its breath. President Kennedy blockaded Cuba. Soviet Premier Khrushchev's ships steamed toward the quarantine line. Military advisors on both sides urged attack. Humanity had never been closer to nuclear war. On October 27th, a Soviet submarine commander, convinced war had begun, nearly launched a nuclear torpedo. Only the intervention of Officer Vasily Arkhipov prevented catastrophe. Finally, Kennedy and Khrushchev reached an agreement. The Soviets would remove missiles from Cuba. America would withdraw missiles from Turkey. The Cuban Missile Crisis ended, leaving both leaders shaken by how close they'd come to destroying the world. But proxy wars continued. Vietnam became America's longest and most divisive conflict. From 1965 to 1973, American forces fought to prevent communist North Vietnam from conquering the South. The Soviet Union and China supplied weapons and support to the North. Despite massive American military power, the war became an unwinnable quagmire. Over 58,000 Americans died, along with millions of Vietnamese. When Saigon fell in 1975, it marked communism's most significant Cold War victory. The space race became another arena of competition. The Soviets shocked the world by launching Sputnik in 1957, then putting Yuri Gagarin into orbit in 1961. America responded with Kennedy's pledge to reach the moon. In July 1969, Neil Armstrong took humanity's first steps on another world, a triumph of American technology and determination. The 1970s brought détente. a thawing of relations. Nixon traveled to Moscow. Arms control agreements limited nuclear arsenals. Trade increased. For a moment, peaceful coexistence seemed possible, but détente crumbled when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan in 1979. The CIA armed Afghan resistance fighters, turning Afghanistan into the Soviet Union's Vietnam. The conflict would drain Soviet resources and morale for nearly a decade. Ronald Reagan entered the White House in 1981 with a harder line. He called the Soviet Union an evil empire and launched the largest peacetime military buildup in American history. The Strategic Defense Initiative, derided as Star Wars, proposed using space-based weapons to intercept nuclear missiles. Whether technically feasible or not, it forced the Soviets into an expensive arms race they couldn't afford. Behind the Iron Curtain, cracks were appearing. The Soviet economy stagnated under the weight of military spending and central planning. In Eastern Europe, movements for freedom grew bolder. Poland's Solidarity Union challenged communist rule. The Soviet system was dying. In 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev became Soviet leader and changed everything. His policies of glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring, unleashed forces he couldn't control. Once people tasted freedom of speech, they wanted more. In 1989, the impossible happened. Poland held free elections. Hungary opened its borders. Czechoslovakia's Velvet Revolution overthrew communism peacefully. And on November 9, 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. Germans from east and west danced together on that hated barrier, tearing it down with hammers and bare hands. The symbol of division crumbled. The Soviet Union itself began to disintegrate. Baltic republics declared independence. One by one, Soviet republics broke away. On December 26, 1991, the Soviet flag was lowered over the Kremlin for the last time. The empire that had challenged America for half a century simply ceased to exist. The Cold War ended not with nuclear fire, but with a whimper. No peace treaty was signed because no war had been formally declared. The ideological struggle that had defined a generation simply faded away. The Cold War shaped everything about the modern world. It drove technological innovation, from rockets to computers. It created international institutions and military alliances that endure today. It influenced art, literature, and popular culture. An entire generation grew up in its shadow, practicing duck-and-cover drills and watching films about nuclear apocalypse. The cost was staggering. While the superpowers never fought directly, proxy wars killed millions in Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, and elsewhere. The arms race consumed trillions that could have fed the hungry or cured diseases. Entire nations became pawns in a larger game. Yet humanity survived. Through crises that brought us to the brink, leaders on both sides ultimately chose dialogue over destruction. The Cold War reminds us that even the deepest ideological divides need not end in catastrophe, and that the human instinct for survival can overcome the impulse for confrontation. The Berlin Wall is gone. The Soviet Union is history, but the Cold War's lessons endure. That freedom matters, that deterrence works, and that in the nuclear age, there can be no winners in a great power war. Only survivors, if we're lucky.